The number one Washington Commanders storyline this offseason, the hiring of head coach Dan Quinn. Why Trevor Sikkema of Pro Football Focus says that is the best move, and why Dan Quinn maybe doesn't get enough credit where he should. That and more on today's episode of Locked On Commanders.
You are Locked On Commanders, your daily podcast on the Washington Commanders. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome into today's episode of Locked On Commanders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, David Harrison, credential member of the media covering the Washington Commanders for CommanderGameDay.com, part of Sports Illustrated, here with you every Monday through Friday. Greatly appreciate you coming through for today's episode. Everydayers appreciate you for coming through every day. This is your daily podcast covering the Washington Commanders. And if you haven't already, you can subscribe for free on YouTube or wherever you are listening to this episode. And on today's episode of Locked On Commanders, we're going to be talking with Trevor Sikkema of Pro Football Focus about offensive line deficiencies. Did the Washington Commanders go hard enough to try to address their offensive line? We're also going to talk about quarterback Jayden Daniels and this Washington Commanders draft class, of course. But we're also going to talk about why Trevor says the best move of the offseason was the hiring of head coach Dan Quinn. If you want to discuss any of that or this episode or anything Washington Commanders with me, all you got to do is send me a text message. Go to joinsubtext.com/LockedOnCommanders. Become a Locked On Commanders insider today. And from there, you can send me your text messages. I will send you my text messages. We'll exchange ideas, information, analysis. We'll also exchange inside information, bonus content, no hashtags, no filters, no apps. All you have to do is go to joinsubtext.com/LockedOnCommanders. And from there, all you need is your phone. Just like you text your friends and your family, you can text me too. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. As playoffs wind down, the sport stops sporting the way that we want them to. But this summer, FanDuel is hooking up every customer with a boost or a bonus every single day. Go to FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. Lead NFL draft analyst and co-host of the NFL Stock Exchange, Trevor Sikkema from Pro Football Focus, is here to talk with us today about the Washington Commanders, not just the draft class, not just Jayden Daniels, but everything going on around the franchise. Make sure you're giving him a follow on Twitter at Tampa Bay Trey. Good friend of mine, good follow on Twitter, so make sure you're doing that. And we're going to start our conversation off with my question to Trevor. Which move this offseason, which storyline this offseason was the most intriguing to you?
It's a Dan Quinn element, I think. Obviously, like, there's a lot of different moves when it comes to, free agency. Obviously, you're moving on from a lot of the Ron Rivera guys. You got to get a lot of Dan Quinn guys in the building. But the Dan Quinn element, to me, is the biggest one. And the coaching staff, particularly, you could throw in, Cliff Kingsbury being an offensive coordinator. Like, that's obviously intriguing as well. But I'm really excited with Dan Quinn getting this second chance to be a head coach, because I've felt like it's a long time coming, right? I'm a University of Florida guy, and so I've known Dan Quinn since his University of Florida DC days. And you throw in, what he did with the Seattle Seahawks as their defensive coordinator, obviously what he did with the Falcons, taking that team to the Super Bowl, been the defense coordinator for the Cowboys over the last couple of years. And I just feel like every single step where he has gone, he's gotten the most out of his players. And I feel like the consistent theme with Dan Quinn is, maybe it hasn't been, consistent success from a win-loss perspective, although they did make it to the Super Bowl. And I think that people don't give Dan Quinn enough credit for that. Like, obviously they did not win it. It was like collapse of a game and everything. And I think that looms over his head. But Quinn put together an incredible team, and he was an incredible coach. And to be honest, like, that team probably should have won that game, probably should have won that Super Bowl. And I think the outlook for Dan Quinn is very, very different if that quarter and a half goes differently in the Super Bowl. I think that people think of him in a different light, and I don't think that's really fair to just what is a really good resume for Quinn. So I've been very excited for him to get a second crack at being a head coach. And outside of the success, I think it's also because everywhere he has been, I feel like his players really like him a lot. It feels like they play really hard for him. He gets the most out of those guys. He looks to their strengths and weaknesses and puts them in position to succeed much more often than he would to fail. It's not like a defensive coordinator who looks at his guys and says, hey, we're going to play my brand of football this way. Certainly he has his ways of football that he likes, but it feels like it's always been very fluid in how he wants to position his players to get the most out of the guys that he has on his roster. So now that he is in charge of not just the defense side of the football, but the entire team in Washington, I am really excited to see what Quinn's going to do with this group.
Yeah, no, absolutely, man. And I'll tell you, I'll be honest, and I've been honest with my listeners, from the jump. I was not a Dan Quinn guy when the coaching search first started, right? I was actually a Mike Macdonald guy. Like, Mike Macdonald was my number one guy. I liked Raheem Morris, the idea of Raheem. Ben Johnson obviously was up there, but Dan Quinn, kind of that outlier. A lot of people I didn't really give him the whole retread. Like, that wasn't my reasoning behind it, but a lot of people didn't like the whole retread thing. But from the moment we first got to talk to him, I've just loved everything that's come out of his mouth. And then the great part about it is seeing what he's saying put into practice, even on the practice field, just in OTAs and minicamp. We're seeing a lot of what he's telling us he's going to do actually taking shape, and a lot of what you're talking about, coaching to his players' strengths and doing all those things. And like you said, man, players love playing for him. One of those players, Bobby Wagner, and he certainly loves playing for linebackers coach Ken Norton Jr. as well, who wouldn't. But Bobby Wagner is a guy that comes in, and London Fletcher, Washington legend London Fletcher, said that Bobby Wagner brings instant credibility to the Washington Commanders linebacker room. I know that this group has now been ranked fairly high, when past years they haven't been ranked highly at all. That's putting it kindly. How much do you think Bobby Wagner really has left in the tank as a player on the field? Because his leadership is through the roof, but on the field, how much does Bobby Wagner have left?
No, I think that he's got enough left in the tank, I would say, for what Washington wants out of him, right? I mean, they know that they're not going to build their entire defense around Bobby Wagner. That's just not where he is in his career. But it's really important, especially when you're turning over as much of the roster as Washington will be, I will say, over the next 2 years, right? You can take this year and next year into it. Having a guy who is that veteran voice, to where, Dan Quinn, when they brought in Bobby Wagner, you're probably bringing him into your office and you're saying, like, hey, man, like, I really want you to be the leader of this defense. We know that you're kind of, I don't know if he said these words exactly, but like the twilight of his career, right? He doesn't have that much left in the tank for his NFL career, we assume. But he probably said to him, like, I want you to help me establish the culture of what Washington football is going to be like, hopefully for the next decade. And that to me is the most important part of like what he has left in the tank, because you look at his PFF coverage grades. I mean, like, the coverage grades specifically for Wagner, really up and down. I mean, the run defense grades have been fine because he's not going to be a player who's going to be out of position. He's not going to get a lot of negative grades because he's not going to get fooled by things like play action or pulling guards, things like that. He's going to be exactly where he needs to be to put himself in a good position to make a play. He's not the same athlete that he used to be, and you see that in his coverage grades, which are much more higher variance up and down that we've seen over the last 2 or 3 years. So you figure, okay, that's going to creep into some of the other parts of his game. Maybe he won't be this great elite run defender that he has been throughout most of his entire career. But again, I think his presence out there and helping guys get organized and the structure, what he is inside the locker room as well, that's the important part. So I'm not going to sit here and predict that I think that Bobby Wagner is going to be an all-pro linebacker, but I do think that even with that not being the case, his presence on the team is going to be an important one, especially with Quinn trying to establish that new culture there.
Yeah, absolutely. We've already talked to Bobby as well as that coach in the locker room, coach on the field role, and he's fully embracing that, fully ready to take on that role. And I think if they were being honest, there's a little bit of an underlying motivation to maybe make Frankie Louvu the future, like, Washington Commander, Bobby Wagner. Obviously, a little bit of a different player stylistically, right? But I think if they can make Frankie Louvu, who was a captain in Carolina, kind of that centerpiece of the defense, I think they would like to do that. Bobby and Frankie obviously have that connection from being in the Pacific Northwest together at the same time. What are your thoughts on Frankie Louvu? A lot of excitement about him here in Washington, and I want to take a step further with you. Do you see that defensive centerpiece ceiling for Frankie, or does he just need to be an exciting part of a holistic defense?
No, I do. I like Frankie Louvu a lot, man. I know that he wasn't much of an impact player when he was with the Jets, but those 3 years that he was with Carolina, he graded really well for us, especially that 2022 season. There was a stretch in the 2022 season, and I'm going to be honest, like, I didn't pay a lot of attention to Louvu when he was with the Jets. He just, again, was not a high impact player. I didn't cover a lot of things that the Jets were doing. He goes over to Carolina, he's playing decently well, but that 2022 season, I think it was, I don't know, through the first 6 or 8 games or something of that season, I'm like, is this guy about to win defensive MVP? Like he was going crazy during that season. Obviously, it tailed off a little bit, but it went to show like the type of impactful player that he was, and defenses started to recognize that a little bit more, and I think started to kind of game plan around him a little bit more. But to me, Louvu is the type of player that, okay, Bobby Wagner is kind of showing you how to get it done from a top-tier veteran perspective, but Louvu's the main one who's going to learn from Bobby Wagner, and then when he leaves, be that mainstay, be that centerpiece into Louvu's, what they hope his next contract is going to be, as a guy who could be the centerpiece of this defense for many years to come. So I don't think that Luvu is just sort of this like complimentary like linebacker two-piece. I genuinely believe he can be an LB1 in this league.
In a vacuum, Trevor says that his pre-draft rankings, Jayden Daniels was not the number 2 overall quarterback on his board. Where did he rank? But why does he make sense for Washington anyway, ahead of the quarterback that he had number 2? That's coming up next on today's episode of Locked On Commanders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And this episode of Locked On Commanders is brought to you by LinkedIn. When you're hiring for your small business, you're going to want to find professionals that are right for the role that you need. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help you find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. LinkedIn is not just any job board. No, LinkedIn helps you hire professionals you can't find anywhere else. Even those who aren't actively searching for a new job might be open to the perfect role. In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you're looking in the wrong place. On LinkedIn, 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. Hire professionals like a professional on LinkedIn. LinkedIn knows that small businesses are wearing so many hats, and sometimes you don't have the time, or you don't have the resources, or you don't have either to make your hires. LinkedIn is constantly finding ways to make that process easier. They even just launched a feature that helps you write job descriptions, making the process even easier and even faster. 2.5 million small businesses use LinkedIn for hiring. So post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. It's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Although Washington Commanders quarterback Jayden Daniels was not Trevor Sikkema's number 2 overall quarterback, he understands the fit in Washington. We're going to hear from him more about Jayden Daniels, the quarterback, and this Washington Commanders draft class coming up in just a minute. Thank you for making Locked On Commanders your first listen of the day, every day, every dayers. Thanks for coming through like you do. Come back tomorrow. We're going to talk about the strengths and weaknesses as we perceive them on this roster heading into training camp, which we will get to pick up next week. In the meantime, if you need more sports coverage, check out Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed to bring you the biggest stories every single day. Again, streaming 24/7 on YouTube for free or on the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Here's Trevor Sikkema, PFF lead NFL draft analyst, on why Jayden Daniels was not his number 2 quarterback, but why it makes sense that he was the Washington Commanders pick at number 2.
Yeah, so I had him firmly as QB3 behind Caleb Williams and Drake May. I like Drake May a lot more as QB2 in this past draft class. There's a lot of people who liked what Jayden kind of brought to the table with what he could be as a dual threat quarterback. Obviously, how well he pushed the ball down the field with what we saw in LSU's offense this past year. I liked May more because I like May's just raw NFL potential arm talent more than I like Jayden. But I do like the fit for Jayden Daniels, right? I feel like if he was going to go early in the draft, in any spot where I still would have picked Drake at number 2 overall, but if there would have been one of those spots early where I was said, okay, like I like Daniels here, Washington was one of them. And you look at what Cliff Kingsbury was as an offensive coordinator and a play caller when he was with the Arizona Cardinals. I know he was the head coach, but the guy who was overseeing a lot of the offensive philosophy with Arizona, it did line up pretty well with the things that Jayden Daniels did well when he was in college. So I think that they're going to really be able to spread the ball out with all the wide receivers that they have. Obviously, you're throwing in Luke McCaffrey there as well, who I think is going to be able to play for you as a unique type of big slot guy. You've got Jahan Dotson, you've got Terry McLaurin, you've got plenty of different throwing options. You throw in Austin Eckler there as well. So it's a lot of different players that you could go to, and I think Kingsbury's going to be creative with how he lines all those guys up. But what worried me a little bit about Daniels was, how much he was able to attack over the middle. I feel like he just didn't do it a lot. LSU did not ask him to do it a lot. Now, again, Cliff Kingsbury did not ask Kyler Murray to do that very often when he was in Arizona. And so they still were able to have a lot of success. But when I'm projecting these guys, not necessarily to specific teams, that's something that I look at and I go, okay, Jayden didn't really have a lot of experience throwing over the middle of the field, which is a really important part of playing quarterback at the NFL level, making defenses defend every blade of grass, if you will. I think it can work in college. It can be a little bit more streamlined one way or the other, especially outside the numbers. But it worries me a little bit when players come into the NFL and have to really learn throwing over the middle for the first time at the NFL level, just because safeties are so good. Linebackers are so good. Like they're just the windows are so small. And so it's just we'll see how well Jayden can pick that up. We'll see how much he even needs that, depending on what the offense looks like and what they want to emphasize. And so Jayden, obviously, I don't want to take anything away from him. He had an unbelievable year last year. He was the best player in college football, no doubt about it. And we'll see how the fit ends up being with him in Kingsbury.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what we talked about, just on the Commanders beat, like coming into it, not necessarily Jayden Daniels is the number 2 or number 1 or whatever ranked quarterback in a vacuum. But when you look at Cliff Kingsbury and this coaching staff, it kind of seemed like that was just the most logical fit. I think most of us kind of latched onto Jayden Daniels pretty early in the process. But look at the whole draft class for the Commanders, Trevor. Adam Peters' first draft class as a general manager. He goes quarterback number 1 overall. So, like this draft class is going to be one of those ones that determines his fate in Washington. Which non-Jayden Daniels pick was your favorite of the group?
Washington was one of my favorite draft classes of any team, and it's because I think that there's a lot of potential starters that they drafted, not just with Jayden at number 2 overall, but I think there's a lot of guys who could really contribute to this team in a big way. I think my favorite pick would be Jer'Zhan Newton, because I had Newton as a top 12 player in the class, and they get him in the second round. And they get him in the second round because of, the foot injury and going through foot surgery. And I guess there's a little bit of an unknown there. But, man, he was just an unbelievable defensive tackle over the last 2 years, and somebody who I think gives you a lot of flexibility with the 2 guys on the interior. You get a lot of contract flexibility with guys like Daron Payne and John Allen as you're moving forward. I think it's a really great trio of rotational players that you have over the next couple of years, or at least this year coming up, that can be a really impactful force. And then, again, I just think it gives you a lot of flexibility moving forward. I would say, though, the group that's the most intriguing to me is what they did with the safeties, because, Mike Sainristil, he's sort of like this safety nickel corner hybrid type of a player, and I would really have a lot of faith for Dan Quinn to figure out what's the best way to get this guy on the field, because Sainristil is probably my favorite football player in last year's class. I'm just going to be honest with you. Regardless of position or draft ranking or whatever, just a pure football player, somebody that every single general manager, head coach, defense coordinator would want on their football team. I think Dan Quinn is the type of coordinator that I have a lot of faith to get Sainristil on the field in so many different ways, as a safety, as a nickel corner, as a pseudo linebacker, whatever it is. But beyond that, even a couple of the guys much later in the draft, Dominique Hampton and Tyler Owens, those safeties there, those guys are like those big, tall, athletic safeties who are also those safety linebacker hybrid type of players. And we saw Quinn sort of dabble with that a little bit during his time in Dallas. And so those are players who, when I remember writing their scouting report, and you write it in a very intriguing way where you go, I mean, I like things about this player, but if they don't really land with the right defensive coordinator, they might be out of the league. They might be a star, they might be an impact player, or they might be out of the league. These 2 guys, drafting both of them, to me, tells me, oh, you got a plan for these guys. You have a role that you have gravitated towards, that you want, whether you want to call it an overhang defender or an apex defender, or just a strong safety that's closer to the box, somebody that allows you to have more DBs on the field but gives you a little bit more versatility because you can bring them down closer to the line of scrimmage as well. To me, them drafting both of them tells me, again, that you have a plan for it, and I'm very intrigued to see what that plan is going to be at the NFL level.
All right, look, we don't get Trevor Sikkema on here every single week. The biggest story in the NFL right now, Brandon Aiyuk, one of the teams he's connected to, the Washington Commanders. Trevor Sikkema's take on Brandon Aiyuk and his fit potentially with Washington, and what they would have to give up in order to get him, coming up next on today's episode of Locked On Commanders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And we're doing that now thanks to FanDuel. Today's episode of Locked On Commanders brought to you by FanDuel. I love sports. You love sports. I love sports so much. I never want the sports to stop. But as the playoffs wind down, NBA is over, NHL is over, we get fewer games, and we certainly get fewer meaningful games. And the sports just aren't sportsing the way that we want them to anymore. But FanDuel lets me keep the sports going whenever I want. All I got to do is open up the FanDuel Sportsbook app, dream up my bets anytime I'm in the mood for some more action. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day all summer long. New customers, you get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. And right now, if you place a bet on any same game parlay with at least 3 legs on a Major League Baseball game happening July 19th, that's Friday, you will get bonus bets for every home run hit in every Major League Baseball game that day. And there are 14 of those bad boys. So place a 3-leg or more same game parlay on the Nationals return home against Cincinnati Reds, and you'll get bonus bets for every home run in that game and every other game being played on Friday. So head over to FanDuel.com. Start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. Yeah, those two guys are interesting to me as well, Trevor. And I've actually pointed this out. Jeremy Chin's only on a 1-year contract. And I don't know if it's too bold to kind of say maybe they're looking, but you basically have 3 bites of the apple. You got Chin, Hampton, and Owens. And if none of those guys, if by the end of the year you don't have faith that any of those guys is your guy, you can kind of readdress it and moving forward the way that you need to. So I'm really excited to hear you talk about those two kind of lower on the depth chart type of guys. Someone who's at the top of his depth chart, Terry McLaurin. The question right now is, does Terry McLaurin finally have the quarterback that can showcase all of his talents? And does he still have that wide receiver 1 ceiling? Because I'll be honest with you, Trevor, here in Washington, a lot of Commanders fans are actually starting to maybe think that they were wrong about thinking Terry was a wide receiver 1 just waiting on a quarterback. Is it possible that maybe Scary Terry isn't as terrifying as we build him out to be?
No, McLaurin is just for whatever reason, he's been such a hot button topic over the last couple of years because people like to say, well, he's either wide receiver 1 or he isn't. And it's like, man, it feels like very few like wide receiver 1s in the NFL, right? There's 32 teams in the NFL. There's 32 teams that have to have a top wide receiver. But yet the language of how we talk about this is like, that doesn't mean that they're all wide receiver 1s. Well, if you take that and you get a little bit more flexible with it, there's just not a lot of straight up wide receiver 1s at the NFL level. Devontae Adams, Tyreek Hill, Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase. But then like even after that, you go, okay, there's a lot of guys that you like, but even then there's sort of a conversation of, okay, are these guys that you run a passing offense around, or are they just guys that you like that are really talented? McLaurin is plenty talented to be able to give you a lot of return on investment. And we've seen that over the last couple of years with poor quarterback play. To answer your question, Jayden brings you the ceiling to get the most that we've ever seen out of Terry McLaurin, in my opinion. Now, the floor is the question with Jayden Daniels, right? Is he going to turn the ball over? Is he going to make bad decisions? That's the kind of stuff that would actually hold him back more from unlocking what could be the best year of Terry McLaurin's career yet. Because shoot, well, we saw it last year at LSU, the way that Jayden was throwing to Brian Thomas Jr. and Malik Neighbors. I mean, like, you can put Terry McLaurin in basically the Malik Neighbors role that we saw at LSU last year, and he could eat. I mean, he could eat just as much, and it could be like Jayden Daniels is right at home. So we'll see how the wide receivers are going to kind of get used on this team. I think that if the receiving group were to stand pat going into the season, it's still good enough to be a really good passing attack and one that you can build on moving forward with Terry McLaurin as their number 1 guy.
I'm glad you said it that way. Brandon Aiyuk has been a hot topic around the league. And of course, he's buddies with Jayden Daniels. He officially now wants a trade out of San Francisco, which I still think is just more contract posturing. But if he were to leave San Francisco, if he were to be traded, John Lynch and Adam Peters have a tight relationship. Brandon and Jayden have a tight relationship. I mean, let's make friends, be friends. What kind of trade package is it going to take, you think, for the Washington Commanders to get Brandon Aiyuk? Because the Commanders are not likely going to want to give up a straight up number 1 pick.
And I don't think that I don't think that they will have to. The timing of things makes it a little bit more interesting because we've been talking about this for so long. I truly don't know how much the timing of this helps or hurts either side. And I guess we'll see if a trade ends up happening, what the price ends up being. I've often said, like, I think the price for Aiyuk has always been a 2nd-round pick. Like, that's what I think. I think it's a 2nd-round pick because is he a 1st-round talent type of a wide receiver? Yes, he is. But you have to think about what you're doing. You're trading a draft asset to then also sign this player. So in a vacuum, yes, of course, you would trade a 1st-round pick for Brandon Aiyuk. But not in a vacuum. You're trading a 1st-round pick for Brandon Aiyuk, and then you are signing him to a massive contract. We've seen what wide receivers have been signing for as of late. Obviously, I don't think that he's going to get like the Justin Jefferson deal, but it's going to be somewhat close, right? He's going to want to be paid pretty close to the top of the market, especially the year that he is coming off of. So I think that contract is why no team's going to give up a first-round pick for him, in my opinion. I could be wrong, but I've always thought that it's going to be probably a second-round pick and, I don't know, some change. Like they give a fifth-round pick, and you also give up a sixth-round pick. So it's to me, it's always been a second-rounder and change for Brandon Aiyuk, where next year's second-rounder is going to be the meat of that deal, knowing that you got to pay him a lot of money. So, look, I'd be very excited about this team with Brandon Aiyuk in the mix. I think that I would hope that Cliff Kingsbury kind of learned from his time when he was in Arizona, when he had Kyler Murray and DeAndre Hopkins, and he had Hopkins playing like a very specific role, and where they were able to have success at times, it felt like they could have gotten more creative with him. And I wonder if Kingsbury this time around would say, okay, I'm not just going to put Brandon Aiyuk in the DeAndre Hopkins role where he's exclusively playing as the far outside left wide receiver the entire game, every week. I think that he has probably learned from that and probably believes that he can get more creative with it. And Brandon Aiyuk on this team would, no doubt about it, be a lot of fun.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if that were to happen, I know a lot of people watching would be very excited, and myself included, because actually draft night, as soon as Jayden was drafted, I looked at somebody and I said, now all I got to do is go trade for Brandon Aiyuk. And someone said, you really think you're going to do it? I said, nah, I don't think so. He'll get re-signed. But here we are. So maybe I was accidentally right all those months ago. Trevor, something that's confused people in Washington a little bit, especially Commanders fans, actually frustrated Commanders fans, is this offensive line. And the fact that the Commanders weren't maybe as aggressive as a lot of people thought they should be or could be in addressing it, specifically the left tackle position. Cornelius Lucas, tested veteran, but never been a true blue starter. Brandon Coleman, a third-round pick that a lot of people had as a guard, and they're putting him at left tackle. And then there's a lack of trade back into the first round. Guys like David Bakhtiari are still out there saying they want to play, and they're kind of proven veterans if healthy, right? Are you surprised that an NFL team would maybe have this perceived lack of energy in trying to address that position, specifically the left tackle position? Or do you think this is more just a fan or even a media creation of panic for no reason yet?
No, I can understand the desire for the offensive line to be better. Anytime you're a fan of a team that their offensive line isn't one of the top 5 in the NFL, you're always going to kind of want to wish that it's a little better. So, when I look at Washington's depth chart and them going into the draft, I remember making offensive tackle one of their potential big time needs that they could have filled early in the draft. But yeah. I also, it's easy to say that in a vacuum. I don't really think the draft fell for them to do that, right? Because you took Jayden at number 2 overall. Look at how many offensive tackles went within just the top 20. What were you were going to trade back into the top 20 to go get one of these guys? No, you're too busy. You've got to rebuild your team. You've got to keep those draft picks around. You're not one left tackle away. Now, obviously, offensive line is really important, but even then, if you were to trade back into the top 20, I don't think you would have had to get, let's say you would have had to get in front of 18 for the Cincinnati Bengals, because the Bengals weren't going to trade you anything because they were going to take Amarius Mims. They loved Amarius Mims. That was always who they were going to pick. But even Amarius Mims hasn't played a lot of football. Sure, I think he's got a really high ceiling, but you could throw him out there right away. So you look at what it would have taken for them to trade up to get a left tackle that they wanted. Like, I personally, if I was Washington, I wouldn't have been sitting there thinking, oh, we got to go trade up and get Jordan Morgan. Oh, we've got to go trade up and get Tyler Guyton. I like both of those players. They could work out to be great. But to me, it wasn't this, if we trade up and we go get this guy, 100%, like, we're good to go. Maybe, but again, that's a big risk. You're moving a lot of draft capital that you need to set up the core of your team because you're moving on from one regime and you're starting another. So I think that, yes, I understand the idea that they wanted to get better offensive tackle. I don't really think they had a lot of options that would have sufficed that people would have been super happy with anyways, outside of selling a lot of draft picks that they needed to build their core out. And in fact, I like Brandon Coleman. I think Brandon Coleman could be a starter for them. Probably not this year, but I think he's got starting potential. If you let him sit this year, I think he could compete for a starting offensive tackle job next season. And I think that that's really good for your timeline with Jayden Daniels anyways. You got 5 years of a rookie contract track for Jayden to put the best team around him. It's not just we got to figure it out in 1 year kind of a thing. And I know this last draft class was really good at the offensive tackle position, but it never felt like it lined up correctly for Washington to really be able to draft an offensive tackle, because I wouldn't trade drafting Johnny Newton in the second round when Mike Sammer's still in the second round. Like, I wouldn't have traded either of those guys for the offensive linemen that would have been left, that would have been the options. I'd rather have those other two guys, knowing that they're very talented football players and that you can get an offensive tackle in either next year or the year that follows.
Yeah, and I think that's the biggest part of this too, is you got to look at this year's draft class that everybody really likes and say which 2 or maybe even 3 players, depending on how high you're jumping, are you going to give back? Which 2 or 3 players from this draft class are you throwing back in the water to get that one tackle? So I think that's a really good point. Trevor Sikkema, lead NFL draft analyst for Pro Football Focus. Great draft mind, great NFL mind just in general, brother. I appreciate you coming through. He's also the co-host of the Stock Exchange, the NFL Stock Exchange. So make sure you guys are checking that out as well if you aren't already. Trevor, appreciate you, man.
Appreciate it, David. Anytime.
All right, folks, that's going to wrap it up for that interview with Trevor Sikkema. It's going to wrap it up for today's episode. Of course, as usual, we could not fit everything from the interview in this episode, so that full interview will drop at a later date outside the mainstream of the show. So make sure that you're staying tuned for that. Insiders, you will get that first. So make sure you're staying tuned for that as well. In the meantime, if you got questions or comments, just throw them into the YouTube comment section. Text me directly by becoming a Locked On Commanders insider at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnCommanders. Don't forget, check out Locked On Sports Today, the first ever 24/7 live streaming sports channel on YouTube. And as always, thank you for making Locked On Commanders your first listen of the day, every day. Every dayers, thanks for coming through the way that you do. Until we speak again, if you're out about, please be safe, be kind, and we will see you next time right back here for another episode of Locked On Commanders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.